Welcome. I'm Pastor Susie Hutchison, and Pastor Bob Miller and I are grateful to be able to worship with you all today. Here we are at week 4 of Lent. Easter is rapidly approaching, and we continue to prepare ourselves for the good news of Jesus through our Lenten devotions and our spiritual practices. Today, we're going to look at how fear impacts our relationship with God. I'm here today after 2 weeks off of work. Now, I love to travel and usually go away when I have vacation time, but this year I took a staycation for very good reasons. It was bookended by 2 big events in my life. My staycation began on the day my second grandchild was born. This is Mabel. She was born on March 7th, and I spent some quality time getting acquainted with this newest member of my family. And while my daughter was in the hospital, I got to spend a lot of time, with my older granddaughter, Mabel's sister, Harriet. Harriet's 4th birthday party was on the last day of my time off. So, since they now live just half an hour away, I got a very fun staycation this year. One of the things I noticed about my granddaughter was how children process fear through creative play. I had the pleasure of being supporting cast member in innumerable reenactments of the Disney cartoon Raya and the Last Dragon. Together, Harriet and I faced many enemies in our pursuit of the dragon gems. When things would get really fierce, we used the power of the dragon gems to keep the enemies at bay. Now, I did something similar when I was a kid. I spent many hours preparing for what I assumed was going to be an inevitable fall into quicksand. Strangely, I have not had to use that skill as an adult. But I do thank Scooby-Doo for all of the preparedness. Now, while I've never actually fallen into quicksand, I certainly do experience seasons of life where I feel caught in a metaphoric quicksand. I have seasons where it feels like the ground beneath me has fallen away. It feels like everything I thought was permanent and secure has disappeared. It feels like it's impossible to get out of the mess. Have you ever felt like that? I know I'm not alone in this experience. I know that people have felt that way through all of recorded history. I know that it is a feeling that people of faith have approached God with since at least the time that the Psalms were written. It's a feeling that the psalmist expresses very well in Psalm 69. It's verses 1 through 3. Save me, God, because the waters have reached my neck. I have sunk into deep mud. My feet can't touch the bottom. I've entered deep water. The flood has swept me up. I'm tired of crying. My throat is hoarse. My eyes are exhausted with waiting for my God. Now I remind you that the book of Psalms was a book used for worship in the temple in Jerusalem. It is songs and prayers and liturgy that faithful people used in community. It's a holy and sacred thing to be that kind of vulnerable with God, especially in your faith community. In the 21st century American church, we tend much more towards that stiff upper lip in our interactions. How are you? I'm fine. I'm blessed. Well, there's nothing I can't handle. Now, I don't know if that's just because our lives are really all simply magnificent, or because maybe we feel guilty for not being grateful enough, or if we just don't believe that other people truly want to hear our truth. maybe on some level, we know that our despair is not permanent, so why burden each other with it? None of that invalidates our emotions. Life hurts sometimes. It's scary sometimes. And we do not win some sort of prize for never letting it show. Last week, Pastor Bob reminded us that God has proven faithful many, many times in history. I find that easier to see in the rearview mirror. But it's a lot harder to know it in the moment. The ancient Israelites who followed Moses into the desert had that same struggle. God had already done some mighty acts in their lives, yet over and over again they're afraid and they feel like God has abandoned them. This story is from early in their journey. They have just been released from slavery in Egypt. Pharaoh has changed his mind about their release and begins to give chase. Hear this word from Exodus 14:10 through 25. As Pharaoh drew closer, the Israelites looked back and saw the Egyptians marching toward them. The Israelites were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Weren't there enough graves in Egypt that you took us away to die in the desert? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt like this? Didn't we tell you the same thing in Egypt? Leave us alone. Let us work for the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to work for the Egyptians than to die in the desert." But Moses said to the people, "Don't be afraid. Stand your ground and watch the Lord rescue you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never ever see again. The Lord will fight for you. You just keep still." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to get moving." Did you catch that? I kind of find it hilarious that Moses has just told the Israelites to sit still and wait, and then God tells Moses, "Get them moving." Anyway, the story continues. The Lord says to Moses, "As for you, lift your shepherd's rod, stretch out your hand over the sea, and split it in two so that the Israelites can go into the sea on dry ground. But me, I'll make the Egyptians stubborn so that they will go in after them, and I'll gain honor at the expense of Pharaoh, all his army, his chariots, and his cavalry. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain honor at the expense of Pharaoh, his chariots, and his cavalry." God's messenger, who had been in front of Israel's camp, moved and went behind them. The column of cloud moved from the front and took its place behind them. It stood between Egypt's camp and Israel's camp. The cloud remained there, and when darkness fell, it lit up the night. They did not come near each other all night. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord pushed the sea back by a strong east wind all night, turning the sea into dry land. The waters were split into two. The Israelites walked into the sea on dry ground. The waters formed a wall for them on their right hand and on their left. The Egyptians chased them and went into the sea after them, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and cavalry. As morning approached, the Lord looked down on the Egyptian camp from the column of lightning and cloud and threw the Egyptian camp into a panic. The Lord jammed their chariot wheels so that they wouldn't turn easily. The Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites because the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." So this is one of the great scenes from Moses' journey, immortalized by Charlton Heston, right? In the movie The 10 Commandments. Everybody knows this story. The people are terrified. They face an insurmountable obstacle, a sea that blocks their path forward to freedom. They can't turn back because behind them is an angry army pursuing them. And then God intervenes by parting the sea. The Israelites walk into the sea on dry ground. There's no way forward, and there's no way back. We all know that feeling, right? Our world is mired in it today. On the global stage, we see the war between Russia and Ukraine. Tens of thousands of lives have been lost. You cannot undo that. Buildings have been bombed. You cannot go back. But is there a way forward? Giant egos make it difficult to imagine compromise. Is there liberation to be found for the people of Kiev or Mariupol? And if they're freed, what type of future can they build from the rubble? What hope awaits on the other side of this sea of violence? We're 2 years into a pandemic that has killed over 6 million people around the world. That's the population of Toronto, Canada. It's killed 970,000 people in the United States, which is the population of Fort Worth, Texas. We can't go back. We don't get a redo on the pandemic. We cannot undo the pain of those families feel at the loss of their loved ones. We cannot go back to the decisions that we made that resulted in the deaths of our neighbors. There is no going backwards. As this new variant, BA.2, is finding its footings in other countries, we can't help but wonder if the way forward that we had hoped for might end up blocked again. Is there any liberation on the other side of this public health disaster? Just being aware in our world today can feel a bit like being the Israelites facing that Red Sea. The hurdles seem insurmountable. Anxiety rises as we sense the threats that keep creeping up on us. There's no going back, and the way forward looks treacherous. We know that God can redeem war and pandemic, but that does not prevent us from having normal human emotions. It does not negate the fear that we feel. It is terrifying to step into the roiling, messy sea that we must cross to get to our liberation. But fear does not relieve us from acting on behalf of God's kingdom. When Moses tells his followers to stay put and trust God, God tells them to move forward toward that promised liberation. Similarly, we hear this story from Matthew 14. It's verses 22 through 33. Right then, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead to the other side of the lake while he dismissed the crowds. When he sent them away, he went up onto a mountain by himself to pray. Evening came, and he was alone. Meanwhile, the boat, fighting a strong headwind, was being battered by the waves and was already far away from land. Very early in the morning, he came to his disciples walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost." They were so frightened, they screamed. Just then, Jesus spoke to them, "Be encouraged, it's me. Don't be afraid." Peter replied, "Lord, if it's you, order me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." Then Peter got out of the boat and was walking on the water toward Jesus. But when Peter saw the strong wind, he became frightened. As he began to sink, he shouted, "Lord, rescue me!" Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him, saying, "You man of weak faith, why did you begin to have doubts?" When they got into the boat, the wind settled down. Then those in the boat worshiped Jesus and said, "You must be God's son." Like the Israelites faced the Red Sea, like Peter faces an angry Sea of Galilee, we too must face the roiling seas of our lives. Some of those seas are going to be global, like war and pandemic. We feel like we have very little control, and our hearts just break for those who suffer. Some are more communal, like New Orleans is facing in the aftermath of the tornado that touched down, or Glendale, Arizona is facing in the aftermath of a mall shooting. Sometimes there are things that we can do that we can offer a little relief to folks. And some of our fears are personal. Job loss, financial worries, relationship failures, physical decline, even death. See, God does not promise a fear-free life. God does not promise a trouble-free life. God does not promise a pain-free life. As a matter of fact, the testimony of the Bible is that God's people are barraged by all of those things. From Job to John the Baptist to Lazarus and Paul, none of these very faithful people had fear-free, trouble-free, or pain-free lives. God's promise is that we are never alone in our fears, troubles, and pains. God is with us. So when we're facing what feels insurmountable, go ahead and lament like the psalmist. Give God every angry, terrified word that burns in your heart, because God can handle our anger. God can handle our desperation, our grief. God can handle any emotion that we have. So whatever you need to say to God, it is our honesty and our vulnerability that strengthens our bond between God and us. And from a human point of view, it's when we can verbalize those emotions that they begin to lose their control over our lives. Even in our lament, maybe even especially in our lament, God will hold us and God will love us. And God's going to send us forth. God told the Israelites to get moving, to step into the place that they feared. There are storms on the horizon of all of our lives. There's no avoiding them. So we step forward with confidence that God will be there. God will be there leading us, correcting us, rescuing us, and ultimately liberating us. After all, Jesus told Peter, "Come," because Jesus was already there in the storm. The promise of God's presence did not end at the shores of the Red Sea or the shores of the Sea of Galilee. The promise lives on. It lives in all the places where terror reigns, from Odessa to Yemen. It lives wherever fear resides, in hospitals and hospices and rehab centers and domestic violence shelters. God is with us when we are wounded, when we are persecuted, when we are terrified, and when we step out of our own comfort zones. So life might feel a lot like quicksand beneath your feet. And there's plenty of fear-mongering in the air. But God is with us. So we step forward trusting that we are never, never alone. Amen.